I would think, okay, this is your dad.
Who again?
Clint. His name's Clint Eastwood.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that
him.
guy.
Yeah.
Scott Eastwood grew up as the son of one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. Yet privilege wasn't part of his story. From the very beginning, he was kept at a distance, his father's name missing from his birth certificate, his opportunities slipping away even when Clint Eastwood himself was directing the films he desperately auditioned for. Scott carried a last name that opens every Hollywood door, only to be rejected over and over for heartbreaking reasons that will shock you. Because the truth about his life and his relationship with his father is far more complicated than you could have imagined. Growing up in Clint's shadow. When people hear the name Eastwood, their minds immediately go to Clint, the rugged cowboy, the tough cop, the man who defined Hollywood masculinity for more than half a century. But behind that towering reputation is a son who grew up in circumstances far removed from the polished Hollywood image. That son is Scott Clinton Reeves, better known today as Scott Eastwood. And the story of how he grew up in Clint's shadow is both complicated and heartbreaking. Scott was born on March 21, 1986, in Monterey, California. On the surface, it should have been a proud moment for one of the most recognizable actors in the world. But when Scott's birth certificate was filled out, the space for father didn't carry Clint Eastwood's name. Instead, it read, "Father declined," an unusual and heartbreaking statement that showed Clint had not acknowledged paternity at the time. The circumstances of Scott's arrival were far from straightforward.
Gran Torino came around where he was talking to me. It was just like this little role.
Yeah.
His mother, Jaslyn Reeves, was working as a flight attendant in the 1980s when she crossed paths with Clint Eastwood. Clint was already a Hollywood legend by then, directing, starring, and shaping an image of himself as the ultimate leading man. But away from the cameras, he was known for complicated relationships. The affair with Reeves was kept secret, away from public eyes. It eventually ended quietly, but not before producing two children, Scott and his younger sister, Catherine. Scott spent his earliest years in the quiet seaside town of Carmel by the Sea, California. Unlike the wealth and fame associated with his father, Scott's childhood was grounded in the stability his mother tried to provide. Reeves raised both Scott and Catherine largely on her own, creating a household where values like discipline and self-reliance were emphasized. By the time Scott was 10, the family had relocated to Hawaii, seeking a simpler life away from the intensity of California. Those years in Hawaii were formative. Scott absorbed the laid-back island culture, but he also grew up with an awareness that his life was different from what many might expect of Clint Eastwood's child. He did not live in a mansion surrounded by Hollywood privilege, and he was not handed opportunities simply because of his last name. In fact, he wasn't even using the Eastwood name at that stage. Officially, he was still Scott Reeves, carrying his mother's surname. Eventually, the family returned to California, and Scott enrolled at Carmel High School, the same area where his early childhood began. By then, he was a teenager trying to find his identity, while knowing that comparisons to his father were inevitable. Clint's presence in his life during those years was limited, and while Clint never entirely disappeared, he wasn't the kind of consistent father figure most kids would want. What Scott received from him were lessons, not in the form of gifts or financial security, but through expectations that he should stand on his own feet. This created a complex dynamic. On one hand, Scott admired his father's accomplishments and wanted to live up to the Eastwood name. On the other hand, he was also conscious that he hadn't enjoyed the same privileges many Hollywood children received. There were no shortcuts offered. Clint, known for his old-fashioned values, believed his children should work hard and prove themselves, regardless of his fame or fortune. That philosophy left Scott feeling the weight of constant comparisons. Teachers, classmates, and even strangers often sized him up against his father's image. Clint was the legendary cowboy, while Scott was the son trying to find his own path. The resemblance between them was undeniable. Scott inherited his father's piercing blue eyes and rugged jawline, but this resemblance only deepened the pressure because people didn't just see Scott. They saw the young Clint, and expectations rose accordingly. Despite the challenges, Scott pushed forward. He grew up with a set of strict values instilled primarily by his mother: respect, responsibility, and independence. At the same time, Clint's indirect influence was always present, even if not in the way one might expect from a world-famous father. Clint's reputation acted like a shadow over every step Scott took, a constant reminder of both the opportunities and obstacles tied to the Eastwood name. Clint's belief in self-sufficiency meant Scott was left to fight for everything on his own, even as his father held the power to make him a star. Imagine auditioning for your own father's films, only to hear no every single time. That was Scott's reality, and it set the tone for the years of rejection, countless closed doors, and the uphill battle of trying to prove that he was more than just Clint's son. A life marked by rejection. For Scott Eastwood, carrying one of the most famous names in Hollywood was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, the resemblance to Clint was undeniable, but on the other hand, the last name, Eastwood, came with expectations he couldn't escape. To avoid accusations of nepotism and to carve out an identity of his own, Scott made a surprising decision in the early stages of his career. He dropped the Eastwood name, and instead, he went by Scott Reeves, his mother's surname, hoping people would see his work before they saw his family tree. This decision set the tone for his path in Hollywood. While many assumed Clint Eastwood's son would have every door opened for him, Scott's experience was quite the opposite. He started small, taking odd jobs like bartending and parking cars to pay his bills while running from one audition to the next. He made it clear early on that his father wasn't pulling strings for him, and if he was going to succeed, it would be on his own terms. But success didn't come quickly. Scott faced rejection after rejection, even in projects connected to his father. He auditioned for nearly every one of Clint's films at the time, hoping for a chance to prove himself. But the results were humbling. Scott recalled that his father didn't simply hand him a role. Even when he tried out for American Sniper, one of Clint's biggest directorial successes, he didn't get the part, and it stung. Clint was tough on his children when it came to work, and if they were going to be in his movies, they had to earn it like everyone else. Still, Scott stayed determined, taking small parts whenever he could get them. His earliest appearances were in Clint's films, but they were hardly the kind of roles that launched careers. He had a brief spot in Flags of Our Fathers in 2006, followed by tiny appearances in Gran Torino and Invictus. In 2012, he showed up again in Trouble with the Curve. These roles were fleeting, sometimes just seconds of screen time, but they kept him connected to the world he wanted to be part of. His big break finally came in 2010, when he landed his first lead role in the independent thriller Enter Nowhere. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it gave him a chance to carry a film and show audiences that he was more than just a famous last name. This role set the stage for bigger opportunities, and years later, he joined the ensemble cast of Fury, the World War II drama led by Brad Pitt. Playing alongside established stars, Scott finally had a chance to prove he could hold his own in serious, large-scale productions. The film earned strong reviews, and although his role was supporting, it marked a turning point because Hollywood finally began to take notice. The real spotlight came in 2015, when Scott starred in The Longest Ride, a romantic drama based on a Nicholas Sparks novel. The movie introduced him to a broader audience, especially younger viewers. His performance earned him a Teen Choice Award, cementing his position as a rising star. Suddenly, he wasn't just Clint's son, who appeared in the background of films. He was leading a project in his own right. Opportunities grew from there. Scott joined one of the biggest franchises in modern cinema, Fast and Furious, where he played a government agent working alongside the film's veteran stars. It wasn't just a role in a blockbuster series. It was proof that he had managed to step into a major Hollywood franchise on his own terms. But Scott's ambitions extended beyond acting. In 2019, he co-founded a fashion brand called Made Here with Dane Chapin. The company focused on producing American-made basics, including t-shirts, socks, hats, and other essentials. It wasn't about flashy fashion, it was about quality and pride in domestic manufacturing. Scott promoted the idea that Made Here represented more than clothing. It was a way to support American workers and highlight the value of keeping production close to home. But through all of this, rejection remained a constant theme. Even after his successes, Scott was candid about how often he had been turned away and how many auditions he had failed before landing the roles that mattered. In a business where many children of stars are accused of riding on family coattails, Scott had gone out of his way to do the opposite. He endured years of struggle and chose to fight for every opportunity, rather than rely on Clint's name to smooth the path. This journey gave him resilience, but it also came with a cost. Hollywood is a world of constant comparisons, and no matter what Scott achieved, people often measured him against his father's towering legacy. Rejection, for Scott, wasn't just about casting calls anymore. It was also about the challenge of convincing the world that he could be his own man. And just as his career was beginning to take shape, Scott faced a loss so devastating it would shake him deeply and remind him how fragile life can be. The loss that shook him. Nothing could have prepared Scott Eastwood for the kind of personal loss that would leave scars deeper than rejection ever could. In 2014, his life was jolted by tragedy when someone he loved was suddenly taken from him in an accident that could have been prevented. Her name was Jewel Brangman. She was a model, a gymnastics coach, and someone who had brought light into Scott's world. But in September of that year, Jewel's life came to a shocking end when the car she was driving, a rented 2001 Honda Civic, was involved in a crash in Los Angeles. On the surface, it seemed like a minor collision, the kind of accident that many walk away unharmed from. However, unfortunately, it turned deadly, all because of a faulty airbag. The airbag that was supposed to save her exploded on impact, and shrapnel from the defective Takata airbag tore through the car, resulting in a neck and spine injury that was catastrophic. Sadly, Jewel did not survive. The news was devastating. In an interview years later, Scott admitted that the incident left him shaken in ways he struggled to put into words. In a later interview, he confessed, "I've lost friends before. I've lost some great friends, but I had never lost someone I had been really intimate with. You know? Like in that way, in a relationship. I think that really affected me in a way that I don't know. Maybe it's made it harder for me to date." He revealed that he didn't even call Jewel's father for over 2 years after her death, saying he simply didn't know what to say. The silence haunted him, and the weight of that loss reshaped his outlook on life. Speaking about Scott's silence in an interview, Jewel's father, Alexander, said, "Quite frankly, I was hurt by it. I was disappointed he didn't come to her celebration of life. Many people were actually disappointed. Many of her friends flew across the country to pay their respects and condolences. There wasn't even a flower sent." However, Alexander eventually acknowledged that Scott must have had a hard time grieving the heartbreaking death of Jewel. And so when he eventually called to apologize, he immediately forgave him. The tragedy was not only personal, but also tied to a much larger scandal. Takata airbags, used in millions of vehicles worldwide, were later recalled in what became one of the largest automotive recalls in history. Jewel's father, Alexander Brangman, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Honda and Takata, holding them accountable for the defect that claimed his daughter's life. For Scott, the legal battles and headlines only deepened the pain, keeping the memory of her death in public view while he was still trying to grieve privately. The emotional impact lingered. Scott admitted that after Jules' death, dating became difficult. Opening up to someone new felt complicated when he was carrying the weight of such a traumatic loss. It wasn't just about fear of love slipping away, it was about the sudden realization of how fragile life could be and how easily everything could be gone. But Jules' loss wasn't the only heartbreak that shaped Scott during that period. Just a year earlier, in 2013, he had lost another person close to him, a friend, mentor, and Hollywood star whose death shocked the world: Paul Walker. Scott and Paul shared more than just the bond of acting careers. Their friendship grew from common interests and mutual respect. It was Paul who introduced Scott to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a martial art that emphasizes discipline, focus, and humility. The training became more than just a workout for Scott. He embraced it deeply, earning his blue belt and crediting the practice with grounding him emotionally at a time when he needed balance the most. Paul Walker wasn't just a training partner, he was someone Scott looked up to, a mentor who offered guidance in both career and life. Walker was known in Hollywood for his kindness and generosity, qualities Scott admired and carried with him. And so, losing him in that tragic car accident in November 2013 left a hole not just in the Fast and Furious family, but in Scott's personal life as well. The back-to-back losses of Paul Walker and Jewel Brangman shook Scott to his core. On one side, he was dealing with the grief of losing a close friend who had shaped his personal and professional journey. On the other, he was grappling with the sudden, preventable death of someone he had been romantically connected to. Together, those tragedies forced him to confront mortality in a way few young actors in Hollywood ever had to.
He's one of the only living cast members from Baby Doll.
Through it all, Scott leaned on the lessons he had picked up along the way. From his father, he had inherited resilience. From Paul, he had learned discipline and humility. And from Jules' passing, he carried the painful reminder of how quickly life could change. Those experiences didn't just influence his private life. They shaped the way he approached his career, his relationships, and even his sense of purpose. In later interviews, Scott made it clear that these losses were turning points. They weren't events he could ever fully move past, but they gave him perspective on what mattered. And as much as these losses revealed his humanity, they also set the stage for a different kind of public attention. Because while Scott earned respect for enduring hardship, he also found himself facing controversial moments when his decisions, words, and actions would bring him into the headlines for shocking reasons. The public missteps that raised eyebrows. Scott Eastwood has spent most of his career trying to define himself apart from his father's reputation. But there have also been moments when the attention shifted toward him for reasons that had little to do with acting. A few public controversies placed him in the headlines, revealing just how difficult it can be to maintain a steady image when every move is watched. One of the clearest examples came in 2020 in Del Mar, California. That summer, local activists staged a campaign against a proposed luxury resort. Concerned about how the development might affect the community and the coastline, they hung protest banners across fences and public areas. Their message was simple: Del Mar didn't need another high-end project at the expense of local character. But the issue escalated when Scott was filmed taking the banners down. The video showed him dismantling the protest signs, rolling them up, and carrying them off. Some of the activists later accused him of implying that he was a city worker while removing the signs, which they argued was deceptive. Whether or not that was his intention, the reaction was immediate. Supporters of the resort praised his actions, framing them as a defense against what they saw as exaggerated opposition. Critics, however, accused him of suppressing community voices and inserting himself into a fight that wasn't his to lead. But what might have seemed like a small local incident quickly turned into a wider controversy once his name and face became attached to the footage. But this wasn't the first time he found himself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Years earlier, in 2016, Scott joined his father for a press interview while promoting two films, Snowden and Sully. Both projects were high-profile, with Snowden diving into questions of surveillance and whistleblowing, and Sully recounting the story of pilot Chesley Sullenberger's Miracle on the Hudson. The interview, however, took a turn when Clint Eastwood, never one to shy away from strong opinions, shared his personal thoughts about Edward Snowden. He criticized Snowden directly, steering the conversation into politics rather than film. The moment immediately became extremely awkward for Scott, who was seated beside his father. Instead of a smooth promotional opportunity, it became another reminder of how quickly his father's personality could dominate any room. Observers noted Scott's silence throughout much of the exchange. He seemed caught between promoting the films and watching as the conversation shifted into territory far beyond his control. While Clint's words attracted headlines, Scott's presence in that moment showed the challenge of building his own identity while sitting beside one of the most outspoken figures in Hollywood. While these controversies didn't derail his career, they both added to the complexity of his public image, showing that his journey wasn't only about landing roles or proving his talent, but also about navigating situations where visibility and family connections amplify every action. Even small choices, like taking down a sign, can become newsworthy when your last name is Eastwood. As Scott has explained in later conversations, much of his outlook on life comes back to how he views his father. Because beyond the controversies, awkward silences, and constant comparisons, his personal relationship with his father has shaped his values, his career, and his sense of self. The truth about his relationship with Clint. While most people see Clint Eastwood as the no-nonsense hero, the cowboy who never flinched, the cop who never backed down, and the director who demanded perfection on set, what his son, Scott Eastwood, has experienced tells a different story entirely. Most fans often forget that away from the cameras, Clint Eastwood is also a father. And for Scott Eastwood, growing up under that roof meant a childhood defined by strict rules, discipline, and lessons that would stick for life. Their relationship wasn't always warm or easy, but it was real, and it shaped the man Scott became. One story Scott has shared about his father is proof of their delicate father-son relationship. As a teenager, he desperately wanted a truck. For many 16-year-olds, getting a first car is a rite of passage. But when Scott asked his father for money to buy one, Clint surprisingly shut the door firmly. Instead of reaching for his wallet, Clint refused to help. At the time, Scott was commuting to work on a bicycle, pedaling his way to jobs while friends enjoyed the freedom of cars. To him, the refusal felt harsh. But Clint's message was simple. You don't get things handed to you. You work for them. This philosophy ran through many of their interactions. Clint believed strongly in self-reliance, and he enforced it in ways that might seem unforgiving. Another moment Scott recalled came when he was 16. One night, he left his 14-year-old sister at a party to sneak off and get a drink. To most teens, it might have felt like a small lapse in judgment. But to Clint, it was a serious breach of responsibility. When he found out, Clint reacted in the way of an old-school father. Scott remembered the punishment vividly. His father confronted him and made it clear, with both words and physical discipline, that what he had done was unacceptable. Clint's words that night left no room for interpretation. You don't ever leave your sister at a party. Ever. It was a lesson Scott never forgot, and one that showed the kind of values Clint demanded from his children. The strict upbringing wasn't easy, especially when combined with Clint's early absence in Scott's life. For years, Clint had been more of a distant figure than a daily presence. Scott grew up primarily with his mother, and only later began to build a stronger connection with his father. Yet despite the rocky start, Scott has always spoken about Clint with respect. In interviews, he refers to him as old school, a man whose methods may not fit the times, but whose lessons are rooted in discipline and accountability. In an interview, he once said, "He raised me with integrity, to be at places on time, show up, and work hard. You get the law laid down, you know, the axe. I look at it like weapons in my war chest now. He made me hustle, claw, and fight. That's all stuff you want. You want that drive." Surprisingly, despite the years Clint wasn't completely present, Scott still believes his father played a more defining role in his upbringing than his mother. In his words, "I don't want to give him all the credit, because Mom had a huge part in raising me too and making me a better man, but he definitely was the hammer." Beyond the professional sphere, Clint's influence also shaped Scott's perspective on family, marriage, and children. Clint himself has fathered multiple children with different partners, and while his personal life has often been described as complicated, his approach to family responsibility left an impression on Scott. Watching his father juggle a demanding career, numerous relationships, and the responsibilities of parenthood, Scott came away with a nuanced view of what it means to settle down. He has spoken about how those experiences made him cautious about rushing into marriage. Rather than viewing relationships through the lens of Hollywood glamour, Scott approaches them with a sense of realism. He has acknowledged that his father's strictness and old-fashioned values left him with both admiration and hesitation. While speaking about his long-term Hollywood plans, he said, "It's an amazing circus at times, but living on the road, I think it would be tough. I don't have a family yet, but I want that someday, and I think about what that would look like with kids and being away from them. That worries me." On one hand, he respects Clint's dedication to discipline and self-reliance. On the other hand, he recognizes how challenging family life can become when personal and professional worlds collide. These reflections tie back to his own struggles with loss and vulnerability. After experiencing heartbreak through Jewel Brangman's tragic death and navigating the difficulties of constant public scrutiny, Scott has been open about how his father's lessons continue to guide him. He may not have agreed with every punishment or every decision Clint made, but he values the foundation those lessons built. At its core, Scott's relationship with Clint is one of discipline tempered with respect. He grew up under rules that sometimes felt harsh, learned lessons that were delivered in ways few modern parents might use, and lived through years when Clint's presence was inconsistent. Yet he never speaks about his father with bitterness. Instead, he frames those experiences as building blocks, the tough love approach that prepared him for the rejections of Hollywood, the heartbreaks of life, and the challenge of living in a shadow cast by one of the most enduring figures in film history. Clint is more than just a legendary actor and director to Scott. He is the man who refused to buy him a truck, the man who punished him for leaving his sister at a party, and the man whose values continue to echo in his decisions today. Their relationship may not have been typical, but in Scott's telling, it was exactly what he needed to grow into the person he is now. And while their bond has been tested by distance, discipline, and the weight of fame, Scott's respect for his father remains clear. Even in moments when Clint's words overshadow his own, Scott continues to speak of him as a figure of strength, a man defined by principles, and a father whose influence is impossible to separate from his life story. What do you think about Clint Eastwood's approach to parenting? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.